So normally with these reviews, I always like to use the original Japanese poster because the movies originally came out in Japan. But you know what? The American poster is much cooler, so I'm going to stick with that. Godzilla 2000 came out in 1999 in Japan, where it was known more specifically as Godzilla 2000, Millennium. And it also had a theatrical release in the United States in August of 2000, making it the first Godzilla movie since Godzilla 1985 to get a theatrical release in America. And no, the 1998 movie doesn't count. Which I guess I should just jump into this right now. After Roland Emmerich and Dean Devlin made their version of Godzilla, it was despised by everybody, especially Toho, because they had pretty much ruined the brand of Godzilla. So Toho decided to pull the King of the Monsters out of retirement after his supposed last film, Godzilla vs. Destoroyah, and start making new Godzilla movies to prove to the world once again who the true Godzilla is. The movie follows 3 people who are part of this independent network called the Godzilla Prediction Network. Basically, they're like people who chase down tornadoes, except with Godzilla this time around. They want to try to find Godzilla, map him, study him, and just to try to predict where he's gonna land next in Japan. So it's a pretty neat concept, and something that we've never seen in the Godzilla series before. On the other hand, you have the Crisis Control Intelligence, CCI, which is pretty much what we've already seen before in several Godzilla movies. They want to try to destroy Godzilla. And at the same time, they find this mysterious rock at the bottom of the ocean that soon reveals itself to be a giant UFO full of aliens that we actually never see. But they soon start to take a real interest in Godzilla and steal some of his DNA to try to create their own giant monster named Orga. And that's pretty much the overall plot. It's a very standard and typical Godzilla movie with no real surprises to be had. Well, I guess if you were seeing the movie in the United States, there was one surprise, but first let me elaborate on the history of this movie and my personal experience with it. So the Roland Emmerich movie was my first exposure to Godzilla, and I didn't like it. The first real Godzilla movie that I saw was Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, and then I just rented out every Godzilla movie that my local Blockbuster had at the time, until I've seen at least half of the series. So by that time, I was well versed into Godzilla to the point where I can consider myself a fan. And then Godzilla 2000 comes out. This was back before the internet was as prominent as it was, so I was in the movie theater. I don't remember what movie I was seeing, but then I see a trailer for something, and it's the trailer for Godzilla 2000, where it has Rob Zombie's Super Beast playing in the background, which is such a ridiculous trailer, but I kind of like it. But anyway, my mind was blown that there was a new Godzilla movie, a new real Godzilla movie that was going to be released in US theaters. It was really a true experience because it was the first time I got to see a true Godzilla movie in the theaters. And it was just a big blessing for Godzilla fans because the whole point of the Millennium series to exist was pretty much to be Toho giving a fuck you to Roland Emmerich's movie because it just damaged the image so much. But for mainstream audiences who weren't heavily into Godzilla, there was a little confusion. Because it was released in 2000 in the United States, and there were a lot of movies coming out that had 2000 in the title because it was the year 2000, people were confused thinking that it was just a sequel to Roland Emmerich's movie. Because back then you had Dracula 2000, which I don't know what that's a sequel to. I never saw it. You had Fantasia 2000, which was the second Fantasia movie. You had Pokemon the movie 2000, which was the second Pokemon movie. And then, of course, Godzilla 2000. So naturally, you'd think that, oh, this is a sequel to Roland Emmerich's Godzilla. But it wasn't. And because of all that, it didn't do very well in the US in terms of box office. But in terms of the actual movie itself, back when I first saw it, I loved it because it was such an experience to see a real Godzilla movie in the theaters. But this movie really has not aged well. I think this movie suffers from the Phantom Menace syndrome when it comes to the Godzilla franchise. I'm not saying it's as bad as Phantom Menace, no, no, no. What I mean by that is that the United States was hungry for a new Godzilla movie. And when we finally got it, people loved it because, hey, at least it wasn't Roland Emmerich's movie. But really looking at the movie, it just isn't all that special. The only novelty of it is that it came out in US theaters at a time when Godzilla movies were not getting that kind of treatment, especially after the lashback of the last movie. Okay, I'm gonna lay off Roland Emmerich's movie. Let's just actually talk about Godzilla 2000 itself. Like I mentioned, the idea of a group of people chasing Godzilla as if he's a tornado is a pretty cool concept. But the problem with it is that they don't really utilize this concept all that much. It first starts out in the beginning when we just think it's going to be a movie just on Godzilla, and then by the time the UFO pops up and attacks Godzilla, that little idea of them chasing Godzilla to predict where he's going to go kind of vanishes. All the focus is suddenly shifted towards this UFO and trying to destroy it. And the characters go through that one thing that, again, I hate Godzilla movies for doing. When the movie literally has no idea what to do with the human characters, they just put them on a roof during the finale and have them watch the monster action. And it should be noted that this was the last Godzilla movie directed by Takao Okawara, who directed Godzilla vs. Mothra, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, and Godzilla vs. Destoroyah. So it's fitting that his first and last Godzilla movies would end with the human characters standing on a roof watching the monsters fight. Now let's move over to the monsters, specifically Godzilla. This time around, he's played by suit actor Tsutomu Kitagawa, who would play Godzilla for the rest of the Millennium series, except for GMK. Tsutomu Kitagawa is probably my least favorite of all the Godzilla performances, and that might have to do with the fact that the Millennium series, at its core, is an anthology series, so each Godzilla is very different from the last, and he just kind of plays it all the same. But I really love this design for Godzilla. I don't mean to get back into the Roland Emmerich movie, but the design here is pretty much what the Roland Emmerich movie should have been. Very different, but still feels like Godzilla. Because this is the first Godzilla movie where he has green skin and not charcoal gray. His spines are now colored purple, and not only are they huge, but they're also razor sharp. And his regular atomic breath is a permanent orange instead of the blue atomic breath that we're all familiar with. But you watch this design, and it's officially Godzilla, and this is probably the most popular design for Godzilla in the United States, because this design was used as the front cover for all of the Atari video games that came out, Destroy All Monsters, Melee, Save the Earth, and Unleashed. And it's only because it was the most recent Japanese Godzilla movie to be released in US theaters. But I really do like this design, especially with the mouth, how intimidating it looks, which actually was not the original design for the mouth. The original design for Godzilla was mainly different in the head, how it looks like that instead of what we ended up getting in the movie. And I think it was because there were problems with the suit. I think they actually made a suit of this design. But whatever the case, I actually love the design that they stuck with instead of the one that was in concept and the one that we see in the Japanese poster. The last point I want to talk about in terms of the monsters is actually something that we as American audiences did not see coming. Because usually when Godzilla gets rebooted for a new era, because we all assume that this just follows the 1954 movie and ignores everything else, we always assume that Godzilla would be on his own. So to have any kind of monster or super being to fight Godzilla was a neat surprise. And Orga is kind of okay. He comes in at the very end, and there are some parts with the special effects that aren't too impressive, specifically with his giant hands and how his fingers never move. The special effects this time around were directed by Kenji Suzuki, who was assistant special effects director for the Heisei series under Koichi Kawakita. And of all the special effects directors, he's probably the least impressive of the bunch, honestly, and I'll elaborate on that more in the next movie. But I wish they just could have done more with Orga's hands. But nevertheless, the fight scene between Godzilla and Orga is really kind of cool, and it gets really creepy, especially when Orga unhinges his jaw and opens his mouth wide open to swallow Godzilla and pretty much become a Godzilla clone, which doesn't work too well for Orga because he probably gets the worst death of all the Godzilla enemies. Like, you think the Kiss of Death in the 2014 movie was bad? No, this is worse. I don't have much else to say about this movie. It's an average Godzilla movie. It's not one of the best, but it's definitely not a bad one. It was kind of rushed because it was made in response to the Roland Emmerich movie, so I would say watch at your own risk. It has its good moments here and there, but ultimately it's not a Godzilla movie that I'd strongly recommend. It does suffer from the Phantom Menace syndrome in terms of going into the theater and saying, I love this, to realizing many years later that, yeah, it's not that great. Now, the US version of Godzilla 2000 is not that drastic from the Japanese version, unlike King of the Monsters, Gigantus, King Kong vs. Godzilla, and Godzilla 1985. When the movie came out on Blu-ray in the United States, I did an entire video about all the changes between the US and Japanese versions of Godzilla 2000, so you can go check out that video for yourself. But to give you the Cliff Notes version, the US version is definitely a little more tongue-in-cheek with the humor and the dialogue. There is some new music, the sound effects are better, the pacing's better because some shots in the Japanese version go on for a little too long, and the US version trims it down a lot to the point where it's 12 minutes shorter. And honestly, with all those changes, Toho actually prefers the US version, and for me, I don't know which one to recommend if you were to watch Godzilla 2000. Because while I admit that the US version has a better pace and it has better sound effects, I just can't find myself getting into movies when they're dubbed. Ever since I saw Seven Samurai and the original Godzilla from 1954, I've always grown a bigger appreciation for movies in their native language. And unless it's animation, it's really hard for me to get into a movie or a TV show if it's dubbed. Especially because when you watch the movie dubbed, you have some really goofy lines and just unintentionally funny moments. Like when one of the characters at the end of the movie asks, why does Godzilla keep protecting us even though he destroys Japan every chance he gets? And the main character goes, maybe because Godzilla is inside each one of us. The only way that could have worked is if one of the characters had looked at him and went, phrasing. So it's kind of a flip-flop in terms of which version to watch, because each of them have their strengths and their weaknesses. And that's my review for Godzilla 2000. Tomorrow we're going to be taking a look at the next Godzilla movie, Godzilla vs. Megaguirus, which I'm not going to lie, I had a struggle watching, but we'll get to that tomorrow. And until tomorrow, I hope you enjoyed this review. Leave a comment down below and tell me what your thoughts are on the movie, if and when you've seen it. And as always, this is the real Mr. Robinson telling you, there's only one.